Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome on this All Hallows Eve. Between the 15th and the 18th centuries, about 40,000 innocent people across Europe were accused, prosecuted, and executed for being witches. The main purpose of this talk is to explain why this witch craze, as it's known, occurred. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. And during the talk, I will take you through the steps that led to the craze in the first place, some of the key events that occurred during the craze, and then why the craze disappeared. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to discuss witchcraft in the modern world on just a couple of slides. Before we start, I would like to warn you that this talk does contain references to death and execution throughout. It also contains a few references to torture, infant mortality, and sex. So let's start with a definition of a witch. There are, in fact, several definitions, but this is the definition that would be recognized by people living in the period. A witch is someone who uses magic specifically to harm other people and their possessions. So this is the use of dark magic to, for example, ruin crops, cause livestock to die and machinery to fail, to kill children and to raise storms, to drown kings, i.e. everything that can undermine society. And if I were to ask you what your image would be of a witch, I'd be surprised if it wasn't something similar to these images here. So this is the stereotype of a witch. An elderly female, an old crone. On the left, you see her creating a witch's brew and possibly muttering some incantations. And on the right, we see a witch riding on a broomstick, arguably the wrong way round, wearing a witch's pointed hat and a dark satanic hat on her back with evil eyes. And you might think that this stereotype was invented by Disney, but in fact, the stereotype has been around for centuries. And to illustrate that, I have this image here is a woodcut from the History of Wizards and Witches, which was published in 1720. And you can see very clearly that the stereotype is there, riding on her broomstick with her witch's hat. In fact, there are three witches flying towards this poor frightened woman on the left. The one in the middle is a demon, a black demon. The devil is often portrayed in black to represent the dark side. And there's a third witch in the background. But you can see the stereotype of the witch's pointed hat and the broomstick there very clearly. So the most iconic description of witches in literature is probably the Witches of Macbeth, the three witches, the Weird Sisters. This play was published in 1606. It was written by Shakespeare specifically for James I of England, who was also James VI of Scotland, and James VI has a very important role later in the story. So the witches foretell that Macbeth will be king. But when Macbeth murders the existing King Duncan, they predict his downfall. And Shakespeare puts the following words inside the mouths of the Weird Sisters. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Face of a fenny snake in the cauldron boil and bake, eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. Adder's fork and blind worm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell drop boil and bubble. Double, double, toil and trouble. Fire burn and cauldron bubble. Cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good. So, riding back now to the 10th century, and the talk will largely be chronological, so I won't jump around too much, but this 10th century document is called the Canon Episcopi. Published by the church, it was a collection of canon law. And what it said very clearly was that witchcraft is actually a fantasy that's placed in people's minds who claim to be witches by the devil, but it's not real. The idea that you can fly to a Sabbath with the devil is a fantasy. The idea that you can create evil magic is a fantasy. And so this was the church's position at this time, and it's a Catholic church. We're talking Catholic Europe. And witchcraft, or at least magic, was very widespread within Europe anyway, because there were people called healers. They were called cunning folk, and you would go to a healer to try and help you, for example, to locate something that was missing, or to ensure that your husband didn't commit adultery. They could create a potion for that, for example. So there was lots of magic. And even people who claimed to be witches, the church wasn't too perturbed by them at this point. But in the next few centuries, things changed. And possibly the most dramatic and appalling events that ever occurred to humanity occurred in the 14th century. And that was the bubonic plague, which overwhelmed Europe between 1346 and 1353. It arrived on plague-infested, rat-infested ships from Asia that traveled along the Mediterranean. These were full of rats that were infected by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And it's extremely virulent. The fleas on the rats then gorged on the blood of the rats and then flew to human beings. It arrives in England in 1348 and destroys large portions of the population and leaves large parts of the country completely empty of people. No one knows what to do. No one can help. And there is utter panic. The advice of a contemporary, Guy de Chauliac, is to go far, to go quickly and return slowly. But almost nobody can do this. By 1400 in England, over half of the people born in the last 70 years have died of plague. That's over 1.5 billion people. That's half the population. Just imagine half of your loved ones, your children, your relatives, all gone. And if it doesn't get you in 1348, you've got another opportunity to catch it in 1361, 1368, and 1375. It just keeps coming back. This devastates society. It also devastates the economy as well. And there are other events during the century, in particular 1381, the Peasants' Revolt, which is the most violent protest that ever occurred in England and causes great upheaval. So this makes people very, very frightened. And it makes people feel that Christianity is under threat. This is a providential society in which everything that happens is the will of God. So if this is happening, this is also the will of God. And so God must be very angry. Another event that occurs in this period is something called the Little Ice Age. This is a significant drop in temperature between about 950 and 1250. This causes widespread disaster in terms of agricultural land becomes useless, and there is widespread starvation. And the temperature actually continues to drop for the next few centuries as well, making things steadily worse. But the result of these two events and other events as well, Christianity is under attack from Islam due to the Turks, that people are frightened. And so this conspiracy theory emerges that God has given the devil permission to work with evil people on earth to undermine Christianity, to test Christians. And it's this conspiracy, i.e. that witches are working with the devil, that spreads right across Europe and causes the witch craze. This is the central thesis of the craze, the central cause. So the idea gets embellished. So the belief is that witches fly on their broomsticks or other familiars, such as a goat. There's illustrations of witches flying on goats backwards to meet the devil in the night and have a party. And when they meet the devil, they form the obscene pact with him. And they do that by kissing him on the anus. And then they have sex with him. This gets further intellectualized later in the 15th century by a publication called the Malleus Maleficarum. That means the hammer of the witches. And it was published by a man called Heinrich Kramer, also known as Heinrich Instantor, his Latin name. And he was a Dominican inquisitor working in Switzerland. There's a very high rate of witch persecution in Switzerland. He's prosecuting witches illegally, as it turns out, and he's actually expelled from the region by the local bishop. He appeals to the Pope, Pope Innocent VIII at the time, for permission to carry on with his trials. And so the Pope actually issues a bull stating that he can, and that witchcraft and the devil are evil. So he publishes this book in a way of kind of getting back at the local bishop who expelled him. And it's a very intellectual book. It poses all sorts of questions about whether witches are real or not, according to other texts and other beliefs, and unambiguously comes to the conclusion that they are real, and that he prescribes procedures for prosecuting them and for executing them. And because it's very intellectual, it's very rigorous, it's a bestseller. It's reprinted 28 times between 1486 and 1600. And when they want to create and run trials for witchcraft, use this book as its intellectual foundation. So it's very influential. And it's an example of a book called a demonology. And there are other demonologies published at the time. There's one published by James VI, as I'll explain. About 3 decades later, we have a very important event in Europe called the Reformation. Reformation refers to the reform of the church. So up to this point, Catholicism was the way that Christians worshipped God. But the Reformation comes in, and it's instigated by the gentleman on the left called Martin Luther. Martin Luther is a German monk, and he publishes 97 objections to the Catholic Church. He wants to worship, he wants to have a loving relationship with God without all the paraphernalia and superstition, as he calls it, and the corruption, as he sees it, of the Catholic Church. So he denies that the Pope exists. In this age, you can pay to have your sins forgiven by the Catholic Church, and he's against that. And there are many other things like the worshipping of saints and relics and so forth. So he wants to remove that. And so this alternative religion, which we now know as Protestantism, but at the time was Lutheranism, later Calvinism and Puritanism, spreads very rapidly because printing has been invented by this point. And what this causes is tremendous tension to a scale that is almost unbelievable. Within a century, there are numerous wars. Catholics and Protestants are tearing each other to pieces. The 30 Years' War, which occurs a century later, results in the death of between 4.5 and 8 million people. Henry VIII on the right is significant for our story because he introduces the Reformation in England. He turns away from Catholicism because he wants to marry Anne Boleyn because his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, has been unable to give him the child, the son that he wants. She's given him Mary, who becomes Mary I, and also, although she conceives many times, she's unable to provide another living child or a son. So he gets impatient with her, wants to divorce her, but can't because the Catholic Church won't allow him to divorce her. So he turns away from the Catholic Church and becomes head of the English Church. This is our Reformation. The other thing that's important about Henry is that he introduces the Witchcraft Act, the first Witchcraft Act in England in 1541. And for the first time, witchcraft is illegal. The authorities believe in this conspiracy that I mentioned to such a degree that they've passed a law against it. And so we don't actually immediately see executions because the law goes a bit too far. So the second slide does have Henry on the left again, but he is succeeded after Edward and Mary, Edward VI and Mary I. He's succeeded by Elizabeth. So the Witchcraft Act the 1501 Act is repealed in 1547, and the 1542 Act is repealed in 1547, and there's a new Act in 1563. So the first Act actually says that anybody practicing magic can be executed. That is too far, and nobody is actually prosecuted. But in 1563, there's a kind of slightly more merciful version where only if you're making dark magic, then you can be executed. So it's not particularly merciful, but it's more merciful. Then we start seeing executions. There's also a Scottish one published at the same time. So one of the first people to be executed is in 1566. She is accused of witchcraft with 2 other women, Elizabeth Francis and Joan Waterhouse, all of whom are from the same village, Hatfield Peveril, I think it's in Essex. She confessed to being a witch and that her familiar was a cat, later turned into a toad, by the name of Satan, which is just another word for Satan. She was put on trial in Chelmsford, Essex in 1566 for using witchcraft to cause illness to William Finn, who then subsequently died on the 1st of November 1565. She was also charged with using sorcery to kill livestock, illness, and as well as bringing about the death of her husband. And for that, she was hanged. So this is this is one of the first trials in England, and it's typical of what happens. The people that are accused are typically women, and they're typically old women, because it takes a long time for somebody to be accused, an accumulation of suspicion. And because people see the world, they already believe in witches, they start to make connections with people who are completely innocent, of course, because witchcraft is an imaginary crime, but at this time it's believed to be true. There's a lot, for example, of infant mortality. So if somebody's child dies just after the old woman down the road has cursed them, she makes a connection, which is false, of course, and believes that she's a witch. And if this happens several times, that person can be tried. And so that's very much how witch trials arise in the first place. So let's move a little bit later now. So we're now in the late 1580s, and the man on the left is, at this time, King James VI of Scotland. He's the only son of Mary, Queen of Scots. And he, in 1589, wishes to marry the lady on the right. She is Anne of Denmark. She's a royal princess. She tries to sail to England, and terrible storms are brought up, and she's unable to, and she has to take harbour in Norway, in Bergen. And so what happens is that James goes instead to meet her there. So in Copenhagen in 1590, a woman called Anne Colden has been arrested for witchcraft. And under torture, she confesses that she and a group of other women have sent demons to stop Princess Anne travelling to Scotland. Colden and 12 other people, because she's tortured, she names other people because she wants the torture to stop. And they're all executed for witchcraft. In addition, a local man from West Lothian in Scotland has a servant called Gillis Duncan. She is known as a healer, but she also disappears at night mysteriously. And he suspects that she is a witch. And she's brought to torture, and she confesses. She names other people, a man called John Finn, who is put to the most severe and cruel pain. His legs are put in what are called the boots. Wedges of wood are hammered in so that it breaks his legs and causes them terrible injuries. It's extremely cruel. There are other people involved in the trial. So there's a woman called Agnes Sampson, who, to James's amazement, actually manages to tell him what his wife said to him on his wedding night. There is another confession by Gillis Duncan. She says, moreover, she confessed that at the time when His Majesty was in Denmark, she took a cat and christened it, and said cat was conveyed into the midst of the sea by all these witches, saying in their riddles or kites, this done, there did arise such a tempest in the sea as a greater hath not been seen. The said christened cat was the cause of the King Majesty's ship, as is coming forth of Denmark, had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships. So a lot of people are executed for this. One of them is Barbara Napier. She's actually acquitted by the court of all charges, but James intercedes and says no, she's guilty, and she's executed. So this is obviously terrible. So James is obsessed that there are witches, and he actually intercedes in those trials himself as a judge, which must have been extremely frightening. He publishes his own book on witchcraft. He's the only monarch to have ever published a book on witchcraft. It's called Demonology. It doesn't add much to the other demonologies, except that it makes a very strong emphasis on devil worship. And the other thing that it says is that because witchcraft is hidden, then the evidence of children is now permitted. So this is terrible, that children can be witnessed, can accuse other people, whereas normally they wouldn't be allowed in court. He now allows this in court. So obsessive. He has his own Witchcraft Act as well, which makes worshipping the devil illegal. So in between these two is actually something called the Pendle Witch Trials in 1612, in which 11 people are accused and 10 people are executed for witchcraft in the village, because it starts with a girl who meets a peddler called John Lawn. The peddler won't give her the pins that she wants, and he subsequently dies, and she believes that she's done it, and it explodes into this trial, which causes the execution of these 10 poor souls. But I haven't got a slide on that particular one. But nevertheless, moving forward, we're now into 1645, and we have what is the real bogeyman of the witch trials, an awful man called Matthew Hopkins. And he calls himself the Witchfinder General. He has not been given this title by anybody. He just decides that he is the Witchfinder General, probably because it makes him a lot of money. And so this happens in East Anglia, and people believe him, believe that he is capable of identifying witches. They just believe him because people see the world, they see that witchcraft, they believe that witchcraft is real. Nevertheless, it's still quite incredible. And he names 300 witches, which 300 women, I think they are all women, and 112 were executed. And he has a rather appalling way of identifying a witch. So a woman who is thought to be a witch is taken, she is stripped naked, she is shaved, and what he's trying to do is collect evidence of the devil's mark on her. And it's thought at the time that the way that you do this is to take a pin and press it in the poor victim's body, and if it bleeds, that isn't a devil's mark. So you keep doing it until you find something that doesn't bleed. So you can imagine the poor suffering. This poor suffering. These pins are not small; they're about 3 centimeters long, and of course they're not clean either. So it's disgusting. It's horribly humiliating and dreadful, and it's often used as a form of torture in its own right. And he even writes a book on it as well. This is the cover of his book. And you see these witches, and what they're doing is they're pointing to their various familiars. There you see, and there's a cat called Holt, and there's a dog called Tom and Vinegar, and so forth. But this is absolutely sickening. He's only in his 20s as well, and he disappears from the record. This probably can happen because it's in the middle of the Civil War, and so he can probably do this because there isn't a monarch. The country is somewhat chaotic at this time, and particularly Puritanism is very strong. And Puritanism is the belief that you should be absolutely pure, and so these rather extreme beliefs are very prevalent in society that can create the atmosphere that makes this possible. So now we come to the last trial I'm going to discuss, and this is very famous. This is called the Salem Witch Trials. So in England, the last witch trial is in, I believe, 1685, Alice Molland. And so after this, there are still trials, but there are no more executions in England. The Pilgrim Fathers, early in the 17th century, form a colony called Salem in Massachusetts. And there they have exported with them the sort of English system of trying witches. And in this particular trial, 2 children have what is believed to be demonic possession. This is a kind of new thing where often children, start throwing objects around. They contort their bodies in strange shapes. They start saying things in strange voices. And so this other girls start having the same system, and then they start accusing other witches, and this hysteria spreads. And between 144 and 185 people were named as witches. 59 were tried, 19 executed. So this is very famous, and it's very well documented. So what happens is that there's several things that happen. First of all, the standard for evidence is increased, and when that happens, that leads to greater skepticism amongst the jury and the judge. that in turn leads to fewer prosecutions. And so you get this opposite effect where less prosecutions mean less suspicion, and they feed on each other until there is at the end no trials at all. In addition, there's a changing intellectual, legal, economic, and religious climate. So we're moving now into the period known as the Enlightenment, where evidence-based science is coming to the fore and people just stop believing effectively. And so the last person, as I say, is Alice Swan in 1685, and the last person in Scotland is in 1722. A few comments about Scotland and England, because they're quite different. In England, only, I say only, everyone is appalling, but relatively few, about 500 over the entire period of 120 years of executions are executed. In Scotland, it's about it's about 2,000 to 2,500, even though it has a fifth of the population. So you're 25 times more likely to end up accused of being a witch. And this is thought to be because England has a centralized government. When people are accused, people from the center of government tend to be more educated and more skeptical, go out and hear trials. Whereas in Scotland, it's divided into local jurisdictions where often the person accused and the prosecutor, the judge or the jury actually know each other. So there's a much more feverish, much more intense panic about witchcraft. So this is thought to be why Scotland has far more witch executions than England. And the same is true in Germany and Switzerland, where they have the most extreme. There's far more in Germany and Switzerland than there are in England and even Scotland, although Scotland is one of the highest. So Germany consists of a very significant number of small states. It's not the country that we know it today, and so is Switzerland. And again, it's where the accused and the jury and the judge actually are likely to know each other. And people bring the person that they're accusing to the judge, screaming at them, look, do something about this. And the judge feels that they have to do something about it, otherwise they themselves will be killed. And so there's a much greater, when you have lots of states where jurisdiction, where the legal system is local, you get many more executions. So effectively, in this period, the climate starts to improve. The plague recedes, and then religious toleration breaks out. Catholics and Protestants are sick to death of tearing each other to pieces, and they resolve their differences by actually living in different parts of Europe. So Protestants live in Northern and Western Europe. Catholics tend to live in Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, Italy. We've had the scientific revolution in the 17th century, which is then merges into the age of enlightenment of the 18th and 19th centuries. As I say, higher standard of evidence, more cases ended without convictions. And then eventually the witchcraft law follows practice and those laws are repealed. Although technically you could still be accused of being a witchcraft until 1951, I think it is, but nobody is in practice, of course. You might think there are no more witch trials, but that is not true. If you want to go to a witchcraft trial, you need only go to Cameroon, Ghana, Malawi, or the Ivory Coast, and also Saudi Arabia. The 4 African countries have reintroduced witchcraft law, and they would claim actually saving lives. And the reason why is because if they didn't have laws, then what you get is vigilante killings. And you see that in other parts of the world. So whether you don't have laws, but other countries. So there are atrocities against suspected witches have occurred recently in Tanzania, most of sub-Saharan Africa, India, South Asia, Indonesia, Pacific Islands, including Papua New Guinea. And so there is a move to do something about this. And the same lecturer, Ronald Hutton, as I mentioned, he helped draft a UN Human Rights Council resolution in 2021 to eliminate harmful practices related to witchcraft accusations and ritual attacks. And this was endorsed by the Pan-African Council in 2023, which has drawn up guidelines to help countries implement this resolution. And it may be that Europe although there are obviously significant differences between Europe, Europe has been through this, and we have eradicated witchcraft trials and killings for witchcraft in Europe. And therefore, Europe could provide a model, because it's the only place where an official belief in witchcraft has been replaced by an official disbelief in witchcraft. And so it may well be that all those poor souls that were executed between the 15th and 18th century may not, in fact, have died in vain if we can succeed in removing witchcraft from the world. Thank you very much.